If your coaching relies on asking good questions, then you really need to pay attention to what's happening right now in the world of AI, because that part of coaching can already be replicated. The structure, the language, the ability to hold a conversation and guide somebody through their thinking, that's no longer where the value sits. And I don't think the coaching industry, certainly those who teach coaches, has quite caught up with that yet. For years, we've been taught that good coaching is about staying out of it. We're told to ask open questions, don't lead the client, stay neutral, trust the client has the answers within them. And in the right conditions, that works sometimes, but those conditions are far more specific than we tend to admit. It works when the person in front of you knows what they think and when they feel able to express it. And it's often dependent on there being nothing getting in the way of them doing that. Now, if you've coached real people, you'll know that that's not most people. Most people arrive managing something. They're carrying loads of stuff. They're trying to get it right, trying not to get it wrong. They're trying to hold on to how they're seen and perceived, and often not fully aware of what's driving that. So you sit there in the coach seat, asking the right questions, following the model, doing exactly what you've been taught to do, and nothing really shifts. And it's not because the client doesn't want to do it, and it's not because you're doing anything wrong. It's because what's needed in that moment isn't another question. It's discernment. And it's the ability to recognize what's actually happening in front of you, to notice what isn't being said, and to decide whether to stay with it or to move. And it's also congruence, because if what someone is saying, feeling, and showing aren't aligned, and you don't see that, you end up coaching on the surface. Now, there's a piece of research by Jonathan Passmore and Andy Nobes that looks at what actually differentiates human coaches, particularly now that so much of what we've been trained to do can be replicated by AI. And what's interesting about it isn't that it introduces something completely new. It's that it puts a language around something that you start to notice once you've been coaching for a while, but that doesn't really get talked about in training. And when you sit with it, what it's really describing is discernment in practice. The coaches they spoke to aren't doing anything that would look dramatically different from the outside. They're still asking questions, they're still holding conversations, but they're noticing more. And that changes everything. They're not just listening to the words, they're paying attention to how something is being said, where someone hesitates, where something feels slightly off, or where the response doesn't quite match the situation. And once you start to notice that, you're no longer just following what's being said, you're working with what's actually happening, whether to stay with something or move past it. Whether to keep the conversation comfortable or take it somewhere less certain, but more honest. Whether to follow the questions that you had in mind or respond to what's emerging instead. None of that sits in a coaching framework like Grow. It comes from experience, but not in the way people often mean. It's less about having done the same job and more about having been in enough situations to recognize patterns without needing everything explained. That familiarity changes how you respond. It affects what you stay with, what you name, and what you choose not to pursue. Alongside that, there's the congruence we talked about earlier. The research talks about rapport and shared experience, but what it really comes down to is whether the person in front of you feels understood at a level where they don't have to keep adjusting themselves in order to be received well. That comes from noticing where things don't quite align, where what someone is saying and how they're saying it doesn't match, and where the words sound right, but something underneath doesn't sit right. If you miss that, you can have a very clean conversation that never really reaches what matters. You stay with the logic, but not what's underneath it. There's also the use of self. The coaches in the research aren't removing themselves from the work, but they're not stepping in casually either. When they bring something in, it's deliberate, it's considered, it serves the client in the moment. And just as importantly, they know when not to bring things in. Now, what all of this points to is not a better model, but a deeper level of practice. One where the coach is constantly noticing, interpreting, deciding, and adjusting in real time. And that's much harder to define and teach, but it's where the work actually happens. If you follow that through, it does raise a question about how we're developing coaches. Because most training still centres on the visible part of the work, the structure, the questions, the neutrality. And it treats that as the work rather than the starting point. So you end up with coaches who can hold a good conversation, but are less prepared for what happens when the conversation doesn't move. When the client doesn't know what they think, or gives you something that sounds right, but doesn't feel right. In those moments, the model doesn't give you a way forward. It gives you something to stay within, a set of constraints, if you like. So if you stay with it, and sometimes that's right, but sometimes what's needed is a decision. And that's where things become less clear, because stepping in has been positioned as a risk. So coaches hold back. Not because they don't see something, it's more that they're not sure they're allowed to work with it. And over time, that creates rigidity. Not in the person, but in the way that they approach the work. The model becomes something to stay inside, rather than something to work from. And that's where something gets lost. If you step back from that and look at what you're actually working with, most of the time it comes down to something very simple. The person in front of you is managing themselves, not just the situation, but themselves within it. They are managing how they're seen and perceived, what this says about them, whether they're getting it right, and what happens if they don't. That shapes everything. What they say, what they leave out, how far they go. So you can have a conversation that sounds clear and it still might not be working because you're not working with what's actually driving it. It's being filtered, it's being masked. Once you see that, you start to recognize the patterns. Some people tighten, trying to get everything right. Some smooth things over to maintain the relationship. Some push for control to reduce uncertainty. And some turn it inwards and question themselves. None of that is unusual, but it's not neutral. It's protecting something. And unless that's understood, the coaching sits alongside it rather than working within it. You can create insight, you can generate actions, but the underlying pattern remains. And so, after coaching, it returns. And this is what we describe as the mask, the pretender mask. It's not something people consciously put on. It's something that has developed over time and now feels normal. The more capable someone is, the easier it is to miss because they're still delivering. But there is a cost in effort, in what goes unsaid, in how much thinking never actually gets used. And once you start working at that level, the conversation changes. You're not trying to refine behavior anymore. You're trying to understand what the behavior is protecting. And that's where discernment and congruence come together. You're working with what's being said, what's being felt, and what's being held in place. And once you see that clearly, it's very difficult to go back to working just on the surface. Which brings you to what actually needs to be developed. It's not just skill. It's how you notice, how you interpret, and how you manage yourself, and how you decide what you're going to do in that moment in the coaching chair. Because there is always something happening on your side too. An impulse to move things on, an assumption forming, a reaction to what you're hearing. If you're not aware of that, you act from it. And over time, what develops is not just experience, but a relationship with that experience. You become more aware of your patterns, more deliberate in how you respond, and more considered in what you bring into the conversation and what you leave. And this is what makes discernment more reliable. Not because you get it right every time. It's more actually that you understand what is influencing your decisions. If you take all of that together, it does change how you look at where coaching is heading. The visible parts of coaching can now be reproduced by AI, which means that they stop being the point of difference. What's left is how you think, how you notice, and how you work in the moment. AI cannot replicate your ability to create deep flow between you and the client. Now that creates a split between coaching that stays at the level of process and coaching that works at the level of shaping behavior. Both have their place, but they are not the same. So the question becomes less about defending coaching as it is and more about being clear on what are you developing within it. Now, what's been interesting for me watching this shift is that for me, it isn't new. It's being described more clearly now by Passmore and there's more language for it. The research is catching up with it, but the work itself has been there for a while. At Pasida, this is what we've been building our training around from the get-go. Not just about how to hold a conversation, but how to recognize what's actually happening, how to understand what someone is holding in place, and how to work with that in a way that creates movement without taking the work away from them. Because without that, you stay on the surface. And once you've seen the difference in this new style of coaching, it's very difficult to go back. So the question isn't whether coaching will continue to be relevant, it's what kind of coaching you are choosing to practice. And if you're curious about that, then why not take our quiz? Is your coaching future fit? It's a short quiz, it'll take about 5 minutes, and it will give you a full report as to where you're at and what your next steps might be. There'll be a link in the description alongside this video.